The most famous trick in ancient history isn't in the poem that made Troy famous. Homer's Iliad ends before any horse shows up. The version everyone knows comes from Virgil, a Roman writing over 1,000 years after the war supposedly happened. So the story you think you know is a later add-on to a much older war. That war started with a Trojan prince named Paris and a Spartan queen named Helen. Every king who'd once courted Helen had sworn an oath to defend her marriage. Book 2 of the Iliad counts 1,186 ships in the fleet that sailed to get her back. They beached below Troy's walls and didn't leave for 10 years. The Greeks won plenty of fights out in the open field. The walls themselves never gave an inch. By the 10th year, both sides had lost their best fighters. Achilles was dead. Hector was dead. Everyone left was exhausted, underfed, and out of ideas. One correction before we go further. Odysseus, the man behind this plan, is the same king who later took 10 years just sailing home. This is what he did right before that voyage even started. His idea didn't involve fighting at all. If 10 years of force couldn't get them through the gate, force wasn't the answer. Getting invited in was. Here's a detail most retellings skip. The Odyssey claims Odysseus had already snuck into Troy once before, disguised as a beggar, to scout the city from inside. Helen recognized him and kept his secret. So by the time he designed the horse, he already knew how the city thought. The builder was a man named Epeus, a boxing champion later poets describe as terrified of actual combat. With the goddess Athena guiding the design, his crew finished the frame out of fir wood in days. It was hollow inside, oversized, and, this part matters later, built too wide to fit through Troy's gate. After dark, a picked squad climbed in through a hatch in its underside. Odysseus, Menelaus, Diomedes. Sources disagree wildly on how many men were packed in there. Some say 23, some say 50. One much later writer claims 3,000. At 3,000, that's not a horse anymore. That's a building with legs. Then the rest of the army did something no defender expects. They set their own camp on fire and sailed off in full view of the walls. Except they only sailed as far as Tenedos, an island close enough to hide the fleet, not far enough to actually leave. One soldier didn't get on a ship. A man named Sinon, and by some accounts a relative of Odysseus himself. His job started the next morning. At sunrise, Trojan lookouts saw something the walls hadn't seen in a decade. An empty beach. No tents, no ships, no smoke, just sand and one enormous horse. The gates opened and the entire city walked out to see it for themselves. By the time anyone reached the horse, the real trap had already closed. Every person in that crowd had already decided the war was finished. They weren't inspecting evidence anymore. They were confirming a party. Shepherds dragged a prisoner out of the reeds nearby, hands bound, sobbing. This was Sinon, and every word he was about to say had been rehearsed. He didn't ask for pity. He said he had nowhere left alive that would take him. His story, the Greeks had picked him as a sacrifice for safe winds home, and he ran the night before the altar. That story hit two nerves at once. He looked like a victim of the same army Troy hated, and like a man the gods now protected. King Priam ordered him untied and offered him shelter. Only then did someone think to ask about the horse. Sinon's answer was the one lie the entire plan depended on. An offering to Athena, he said, built oversized on purpose. Because if it ever stood inside Troy's walls, her protection would belong to the city instead of the fleet. In one sentence, he turned a wooden trap into stolen good luck. The Trojans were about to pull their own destruction through the gate and feel clever doing it. Not everyone bought it. A priest named Laocoon ran down shouting a warning that survived 3,000 years. I fear Greeks, he said, even when they come bearing gifts. He drove his spear into the horse's flank to prove his point. The wood rang hollow. Metal clinked faintly somewhere inside. Nobody in the celebrating crowd seemed to hear it. Then, according to Virgil, 2 sea serpents came ashore and dragged Laocoon and his sons under. To everyone watching, that wasn't a tragedy, it was a verdict. The one man who struck the horse had just been punished by a goddess, or so it looked. A second warning came from Princess Cassandra, who could genuinely see the future. A curse from Apollo guaranteed one thing: she'd always be right and never be believed. She told them plainly the horse was full of armed men. Not a warning dressed as poetry, a flat statement of fact. The crowd patted her shoulder and went back to the ropes. Troy had 2 separate warnings, a priest and a prophet, and dismissed both in the same afternoon. The horse, built too wide for the gate, forced a decision. Trojans tore down part of their own wall to let it through. 10 years of siege never opened that gap. One evening of celebration did. By nightfall, the horse stood in the city center, buried in flowers. Troy threw the largest celebration of the entire war. A decade of fear ending in a single night was worth any risk as far as they were concerned. By midnight, the guards were drunk and the streets had gone quiet. Homer adds one more scene from that same night. Helen walked around the horse 3 times, calling out in the voices of the hidden soldiers' own wives. Inside, one man heard his wife's voice and started to answer. Odysseus clamped a hand over his mouth until she'd moved on. That's the moment the entire plan nearly unraveled from the inside. Later that night, Sinon lit a signal fire down on the beach. Out past Tenedos, the fleet turned back toward Troy. The hatch opened, and the squad dropped down a rope into a city that was fast asleep. They had one task, and it had nothing to do with fighting. Walk to the gate, lift the bar, open it from inside. Everything the horse was built to do ended right there. The fleet came back through a gap the Trojans had opened themselves in a city too drunk to notice. By some accounts, it was over before sunrise. The city that survived 10 years of siege burned in a single night. King Priam died in his own palace. Helen went home with Menelaus. A Trojan named Aeneas carried his father out of the fires, and Romans later claimed his bloodline founded their city. Strip away the wood and the serpents, and what actually beat Troy was timing. The horse gave the Trojans a reason to want the war finished. Sinon gave them a story that let them feel smart while agreeing to it. Two people, a priest and a princess, said the truth outright and were ignored both times. None of that required magic. It required an exhausted city that badly wanted to stop being afraid. So, did any of this really happen? Troy is a real place, a mound called Hisarlik on Turkey's Aegean coast. Heinrich Schliemann dug there in the 1870s looking for Homer's city. Decades later, archaeologist Carl Blegen identified a layer called Troy 7a, destroyed violently around 1180 BC. Arrowheads turned up lodged in wallstones. Skeletons were found in the streets, not buried. The ancient chronologer Eratosthenes even dated the fall of Troy to a specific year, 1184 BC. Almost nobody who studies this seriously believes an actual wooden horse walked through that gate. The Greek writer Pausanias already guessed it was a siege engine since Bronze Age battering rams sometimes wore animal-shaped covers. Others point to Poseidon, god of both earthquakes and horses, and a real quake that cracked the walls. A shaking wall retold for centuries could easily turn into a gift horse from the sea. A third theory is almost embarrassingly simple. Greek poets sometimes called their ships seahorses, and a wooden horse full of men may just be ships full of men, remembered wrong. Nobody will ever prove which version is true. What's provable is the pattern underneath the story, and that part doesn't need an ancient city to still be true. Cassandra's curse wasn't that she lied. It was that the truth changed nothing when people preferred a different ending. Tourists walk across Hisarlik today without needing to believe in any horse at all. The ground doesn't remember a trick. It remembers a city that chose comfort over caution once at exactly the wrong moment.